Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. Hope you had a nice weekend. We are going to shift to a new topic this week. As always, we'll focus on citizen and social class, but we're going to first finish up our lecture on rule of law. I thought it would be useful for us to kind of take a look at the lay of the land worldwide and assess the state of rule of law and to what degree democracies are strengthening the rule of law or if the rule of law is in decline on balance. And you'll see when we take a look at the evidence that it may be less than promising. Before I get there, though, I want to address some of these different perspectives I gave you on causes of the rule of law. So far, we've talked about the historical perspective, which focuses on the different legacies or the different types of legal traditions that countries have that have been argued to be at the foundation of the rule of law. So remember that one argument is that the common law tradition in Britain is an explanation for the emergence of the rule of law because the idea is apparently that the common law tradition fosters independent judges. But we saw that the principle of parliamentary sovereignty in Britain really kind of eclipsed the independence of the judiciary. It weakened the judicial independence, and it strengthened the legislature vis-a-vis the court. So that weakens that historical argument. Also, the civil law courts in the United States actually appear to be more independent and autonomous on the whole than do the common law courts in Britain. And that's important because, according to the argument, common law courts and judicial bodies should be more independent than civil law courts. And then finally, there's the simple fact that the tradition of activism in Britain is quite minimal, and there isn't actually a great deal of judicial independence compared to, say, the United States. That's one perspective, the historical argument. The delegative models are interesting too, because they make different arguments about what kinds of actors courts are and what kinds of forces or processes might shape courts to be a certain way. And the first argument is that politicians or legislatures have reasons to give courts independence and to create autonomous court bodies. And the main reason, according to the first argument, is that legislatures have deals that they've struck. The parties to any given majority have deals, and they enforce those deals by creating an independent judiciary that can rule in favor of that enacting legislature so as to enforce the deals that are inherent in the legislation passed by that body. But the problem with this argument is that courts might be strategic and they might not rule in favor of the enactor. They might rule in favor of the successor with a different set of interests or a different set of objectives. The main problem with this argument is that courts are viewed as passive and docile and subservient, when in reality they might have their own agenda or their own strategy. The second argument is that independent judiciaries function to let politicians avoid blame for bad policies. But this is a similarly flawed perspective because a strategic court may choose to not take the case for the very same reasons, because it's a bad policy and they don't want to assume blame or the weight of the burden of that policy. Why would they be any more inclined to accept responsibility if a legislature is equally inclined to avoid blame for that bad policy? strategic courts should act in a similar way, and so they would probably be expected to avoid blame. So that argument is also limited in its application, or at least it's flawed in its reasoning. The third argument is that independent judiciaries function to allow legislatures to control the executive. But you know already that in a parliamentary system, the survival of the executive depends upon the survival of the legislature and vice versa. And their linked fate in this way means that there isn't a powerful motivation for the legislature to monitor or check the executive, because in many ways that is built in. They lack a motivation to invest in an independent judiciary for this reason. And so maybe in a presidential system, but in a parliamentary system, you know already that a key source of that incentive is gone. And then finally, there's the argument that an independent judiciary functions as an insurance policy against domination by a future majority. Now, think about what that implies. That implies that that same political party or that same majority, once it's back in power, should renege and take away the independence of the judiciary that it previously created, so as to free itself of the same constraints that it sought to impose on its successors. If that legislature in the first place is strategic in that way, why wouldn't it be strategic in the same way once it returned to power? The point is, if actors are strategic, including the court, many of these arguments simply don't add up. And the fourth one is one that's interesting because it suggests that once an independent judiciary is in place, even if a legislative majority conceivably has the power to take away that independence, there's something about the independence of that judiciary that is self-perpetuating or that makes it more difficult to reverse course. There's something about that relationship, that rule of law relationship, that makes it difficult for any legislative majority to simply walk in and take it away. And this is the essence of an institution, as you know. Once we create an institution or a pattern or a new process, that changes the political environment in ways that are irreversible. And we can't disregard or ignore that new institution because it's there now. And we can either adapt our behavior and incorporate it into our behavior and strategy, or we can choose to not participate at all. But we can't necessarily just leave. We can't walk away. And so this is the essence of an institution. And what I want to suggest to you is that there are strategic, political, historical, a whole number of different reasons why an independent judiciary sticks once it's in place. And at the same time, though, I want you to consider that the democratic rule of law, as critical as it is also somewhat fragile, in that it may be tenuous and that it may be subject to reversal or decay or decline based upon changes in the political environment or any number of changes in any number of domains that might affect democratic politics. And that's what we're going to get into today. And the interesting thing that we can address in a moment, but let me go back. Jeffrey has asked a question. Jeffrey has asked, what do I mean when I say such judiciaries function as an insurance policy against domination by a future majority? So when I say that it functions as an insurance policy, it's the idea that a legislature or a majority, fearful that a successor, another legislature in the future, might reverse their policies or might change all the policies that they put in place, gives independence to the judiciary out of hopes that that judiciary will help to defend their policies from reversal once they leave power and they're replaced by a new majority in the future. The idea is that giving the judiciary independence can help to protect a legislature's policies, the majority's policies, and protect them from the actions of some future government. Now, that's the theory. And so when we say an insurance policy, we basically just mean like a firewall, like a protection against confiscation or reversal or veto or whatever. Now, whether it functions that way in practice is a separate question, but the argument is that some legislatures will give judicial independence to the courts because they view that independence as a way that the courts can protect their policies in the future from reversal or actions taken by some subsequent majority against the earlier legislature. Now, so far in this discussion, I've been talking mainly about the concept and theory of rule of law. And this has been a very, very abstract discussion. We've talked about the role of equality, accountability. We've talked about the role of tolerance and democratic culture and civil society. And accountability has been an important component of this discussion because democratic rule of law means that there is a set of rules to which all actors in society obey, or they comply with those rules. They adhere to those rules, including the leaders, including the elites who are in charge of the society. And this discussion begs a number of questions. It begs the question first, what is the actual state of democratic rule of law? The world over, is the world more or less institutionalized than it was 20 years ago? In that sense, I mean, is rule of law more or less a feature of politics today than it was 20 years ago? Is rule of law more or less institutionalized today than it was 20 years ago? What is the state of democratic rule of law on balance? Does anyone want to comment or reflect on their understanding of where we are today in the sort of condition or state of democratic rule of law, if we understand it as accountability, equality, civil society, rights and liberties? What is your sense? You don't even need to be correct. I just am wondering, what is our pulse on this question? When you look out at the world as a student or a scholar of politics, does the world appear to be more or less democratic in terms of the adherence to rule of law or norms of rule of law? What do you think, Efren?
For me personally, I don't think in comparison, I think it's kind of like this. Oh my god, I think it's like the same because of like, so basically my it's like where I'm coming is like from like the past we had like basically like struggled to get like freedom rights, and even as now, especially like in Hong Kong or in protests like in the south, in the east of like Southwest Asia and all that stuff, especially, it's kind of been like a struggle to have a democratic state, especially what's in like its elections and its civil rights and liberties. So I think that the state of of democratic rule is like the same. It hasn't like there hasn't been like that much progress, even though people say there has been progress, but there's like much to do.
Okay, let's hear from some others. What do the rest of you all think? What is the state of democratic rule of law today? Is rule of law more or less institutionalized today? Yes, Jeffrey.
I would go back even further, 20 years ago. I would go back after World War II. That's when I think rule of law was actually established once the United Nations was implemented, simply because before World War II, we basically just saw how nations, totalitarian governments just wanted to conquer other nations and to basically establish their own totalitarian regimes, and it's basically that after that, that's when the United Nations actually created, their own constitution of
But
like
hold on,
restricting.
let me
Okay.
just interrupt. So the United Nations doesn't enforce domestic rules, though, right? We're talking about domestic politics. So,
Okay, within the U.S.
or just within any country.
Okay, okay. Um,
Are
I would
countries
say.
individually more or less democratic or rule of law oriented?
Okay, I see your question. I, I would say I'll think more about the second question.
Okay, let's hear from some more. So, unfortunately, democratic rule of law is in decline. If we understand rule of law as equality, institutional accountability, adherence to law, law above actors or elites or personalities, if we understand democratic rule of law in that way, democratic rule of law is in decline. Now, notice that last week I had you read two different kinds of articles. I had you read the O'Donnell piece about democratic rule of law, that classic article in the Journal of Democracy, but I also had you read the 2019 report from Freedom House. Now, there was a reason for that, because Freedom House is a measure of civil rights and political liberties on a country level. Every year, they produce a report on the state or the condition of civil rights and political liberties in every individual country in the world. And they assign a score to those individual countries based upon the civil rights and political liberties enjoyed by citizens in that country that year, ranging from 1 to 7. And countries can be either fully democratic or they can be fully authoritarian or somewhere in between. Freedom House is a useful way for us to think about rule of law because it's sort of like a bellwether for the state's protection and enforcement of those basic laws, those basic relationships of accountability that we associate with democracy. Countries that do poorly in the Freedom House rankings are those countries where those basic aspects of rule of law, equality, and accountability are in decline or suffer. And what we know is that when we look at the trends and the patterns over the last few decades, unfortunately, democratic rule of law, democratic rights and liberties are in decline. And for the first time in a few decades, in 2006, the trend began to go in reverse and began to fall. And until then, for many years, there'd been a gradual increase in both the number and the proportion of countries that were either electoral democracies having basic elections and protection of most rights and liberties, or liberal democracies, countries with competitive elections and a whole range of rights and liberties and due protection. Countries had largely continued to increase in number for several decades until about 2006, when the number of democracies began to go in reverse and the proportion began to fall. And for about 15 years, the pattern has been a negative one. In the 2019 report from Freedom House goes into a lot of detail discussing some of the country level experiences, particularly regarding accountability, equality, enforcement, and protection of rights and civil liberties. And it goes into quite a bit of detail talking about how power has been increasingly concentrated in the hands of executives and presidents and prime ministers in many former democracies, countries that are now slipping into authoritarian rule. And this sort of decline in democracy sets the context for us, and it forces us to begin to assess the circumstances and the condition of rule of law and the state of rights and liberties. And this is a figure from the 2019 Freedom House report. And this shows you 14 years of democratic decline. Countries with net declines in their aggregate freedom in the world score have outnumbered those with gains for the past 14 years. And so, what that means is that on balance, countries have become less, not more, democratic. And specifically, they've become less, not more democratic in terms of those civil rights and political liberties that relate to equality and protection of rights and liberties, accountability and good governance, limits on executive or institutional abuses of power. All of those different dimensions of law and democratic rule of law that we've discussed in detail in our more theoretical discussions so far. So, this is where we are, everyone. And many of you may have known this. Many of you may not have known this. But this is where we are. And this is a moment that forces us to pause and think about where we are in history and what this suggests about the future of rule of law and of democratic rights and liberties. It makes us think about where we'll be in 10 or 15 years. In 2005, democracy was riding high. In fact, that was the moment where a larger proportion of countries than ever before were democratic. And we had no reason to think that countries would become less democratic. In fact, there were books written like The End of History by Francis Fukuyama, who wrote that markets in democratic systems were the end of history and that we would never look back. And he's since reneged and said that he was wrong. And he wasn't the only one who was surprised beginning in 2006 to see this decline in democratic rights and liberties the world over. There have been many who've written about how surprising this turn of events is to them in their view. Now, many of us don't find this as surprising because 2005 was really a period where a larger economic decline began. And if you think about some of the economic sources of democratic disillusionment, economic crisis and periods in the business cycle and some of the downsides of the global economy would seem to coincide with some of this democratic disillusionment. But even so, the surprise and the wonder around this democratic decline has inspired a lot of debate and a lot of discussion. And what I thought would be useful for us is to think about the rule of law issues at stake. Obviously, questions of rights and liberties are pertinent to the rule of law. That's pretty self-evident. But I want to hone in on the precise substantive content of this decline in rule of law and point out what behaviors have been taken by, in particular, the dictators and the authoritarian elites who've been at the forefront of this decline, who've led the erosion of democratic institutions and rights and liberties. Now, you'll see some very familiar characters in this discussion. And for some of you, you may be familiar already with the behavior in question. For many of you, this will be new. But what I want us to focus on is the sources of some of this erosion and the empirical circumstances and the social and political and economic circumstances surrounding the decline in rule of law the world over. So our starting point, as you already know, is that less than half the world's countries are now democratic. And not just that, it's also the case that of the world's 15 largest countries, only 6 of them are democracies. The rest are dictatorships. That's distressing because it suggests that some of the biggest players, some of the most prominent countries on the world scale are dictatorships, in that there may not, in fact, be any rhyme or reason to democratic development. But let's go ahead and get started and discuss some of these figures in this discussion. One of the one of the worst offenders, is this guy Duterte in the Philippines, who's synonymous with the drug war and the drug eradication effort there, where he basically gave police and security forces carte blanche authority to kill suspected drug dealers, and I think even users for that matter. But in the Philippines, there's been a crackdown on these elements of society, or anyone who's suspected of being associated with this activity. And more generally, there's been a decline and an erosion in rights and liberties. The Philippines is a gigantic country, and it's a large and growing country. And so what happens there is very consequential, not just because of the simple fact that humans are involved, but because the Philippines is growing in importance and is a large and growing market for many of the biggest countries in the global economy. And so, in addition to the drug war, opposition media have been shut down. Critics on the Supreme Court and in the Senate have been ousted and even jailed in many cases. The Supreme Court has been totally politicized. It's now mainly an instrument of Duterte and in the authoritarian regime. Anti-corruption chiefs in the leadership of important bodies of the state involved in corruption efforts have been threatened. Election anomalies are also on the rise. It's evident, for example, that elections are less competitive than ever before. In a variety of ways, the Philippines is less supportive of rule of law than ever before. And it's concerning because the Philippines was an emerging democracy, and a large country at that, and one that held out and held great potential for the expansion of democracy and its prospects in Asia. And so these sorts of declines and these sorts of losses in rule of law are what characterize many of the country experiences that we'll discuss today. When you look at this list, it's almost unfathomable, the declines in some of these places, but it is fathomable because, unfortunately, in many of these countries, democracy was never very well developed. And in a lot of Latin American countries, for example, political parties have often been very weak, and some of the democratic institutions have been very vulnerable to some of these abuses. And in the Philippines, a country that was also a new democracy, it appears to have been equally subject to backsliding and equally vulnerable to some of these declines. And so we'll talk about the Philippines again, but let's go to Europe temporarily, where Hungary is another example of a country that has fallen quite far from where it originally was. And we can call it democratic grace because until 2010, the country was a stable and prosperous democracy, and one of the best examples in Europe of a new emerging democracy, a post-Soviet socialist state with relatively competitive and durable party system and robust institutions, competitive and fair elections, free elections, protection of rights and liberties, peaceful assembly, and well-organized civil society. But in 2010, Viktor Orban and his party won power, and they very shortly used their supermajority to make constitutional changes that tilted the playing field and that eroded the spirit of equality and in a kind of spirit of rule of law. And they packed the constitutional court and politicized the court. They limited opposition media access and intimidated opposition media, and they gerrymandered districts to lock in their control and prevent a loss of any influence really going forward. And to this day in Hungary, the country remains under the control of Orban's party. And in every way, the episode uh, is indicative of this sort of institutionalized legal facade, or this kind of democratic erosion that takes place through what appear to be legal processes, but in spirit involves really the destruction of democratic institutions. And what's interesting about this is that in earlier decades, rule of law was often subject to military coup, and the violations of rights and liberties were often more blatant and more evident and easier to scrutinize, and easier to subject to international criticism. But today, many of these declines are much more fly by night, and they're much more gradual, and they take place in a way that is more glacial. And it's been referred to as a process of decay, because it takes place in what are essentially legal ways, but the result is always the same. And that result is the devastation of what was previously a system that supported a democratic rule of law, or that was at least more inclined to hold actors accountable and lead to good governance and support equality and accountability between institutions. Hungary is an example in Europe. Hungary is notable because there are so few examples in Europe. Belarus might be the only other close example of a democracy that went into decline in Europe, even despite the weakness of many of the post-socialist republics early on in the 1990s and the 2000s. In Africa, there's also been a similar decline in those cases where democracy was relatively well established, and where the question was the development of strong parties and competitive party systems. And so the example of Benin is a good example, because it highlights the fall from grace of one of the latest and newest new democracies, but one that appeared to be best positioned for success. Benin was a post-Cold War transition, in one of the early ones in the 1990s. It was held up as an example of the stability and the prospects for success of some African countries. But very early on in the administration of Patrice Talon, who was elected a handful of years ago at this point, he began arresting prominent critics, including opponents who would seek potentially to challenge him in re-election bids. He immediately also imposed new electoral rules that made it virtually impossible for rivals to run, or much less win. And very, very quickly, Talon transformed the country into what was essentially an authoritarian regime, in one by design, in institutional content and substance. This is an example of this de-democratization by legal facade, this process of democratic decline that takes place in what is essentially a legal and orderly way, but in a way that nevertheless undoes any of the earlier successes and shows the vulnerability of the institutions to erosion and decline. And in Benin, in addition to the arresting of prominent critics and the imposition of a new system, individuals increasingly don't enjoy the same protections for assembly or peaceful opposition. And the society is much less supporting of the democratic rule of law that previously existed. And this is, of course, especially discouraging because the African democracies are the newest. They're the newest democracies. And so the need to support fledgling democratic institutions and promote democratic rule of law is especially apparent in places where it's very, very fragile. And those places are often in Africa, and places where democratic institutions are quite new. And Latin America has many examples that we can look at too, and we'll look at those in a moment. But I want to give you one more example from Africa, where these powerful executives and these ruling presidents more generally have been often at the forefront of this process of sort of gutting institutions designed to promote rule of law. And so in the case of Senegal, Macky Sall, who's the ruling president there, to win re-election, jailed two of his top rivals. And then he also himself imposed a new electoral law. And this new electoral law had the effect of narrowing the opposition field substantially to just a couple candidates who had virtually no popularity and no popular support, and therefore represented no challenge to his reelection. It was the smallest field in 3 decades, and yet again seemed to indicate the decline and erosion of rule of law. And in no way would we suggest that this situation and an outcome was consistent with a system of rule of law and a system of norms and rules and laws that all must obey. Macky Sall, like Talon and Benin, changed the rules to advantage himself, and into the process virtually wiped out his opposition and ensured his reelection. This both undoes the very nature of democracy and also, of course, destroys that rule of law as well. And indeed, that rule of law can be destroyed in a variety of ways. And one example, and one that is no doubt more controversial, and one that is viewed very differently by different voices and different analysts, is the example of Bolivia. And I happen to view this as an example of sort of a reversal of democracy and a democratic decline. And it certainly does relate to the question of the rule of law and accountability and equality as well. And so the example of Bolivia centers on Evo Morales, who is the former longtime president of that country. And the case really has to do with what he tried to do in 2019. He tried to run for a fourth term that year after losing a referendum held to determine whether he could run again 3 years earlier. And he claimed victory in this disputed race, despite having lost the referendum in the first place. And as a result, generated and caused a significant popular upheaval and eventually mounting military pressure to resign because of the unwillingness of Bolivians to accept his claim to victory, especially under the circumstances after having lost a referendum. He did eventually resign on November 10th, 2019, but in his place came a interim government that itself was unelected and that ruled Bolivia in a repressive and illiberal way. Eventually, however, that interim government was replaced by a newly elected democratic government. But in the short term in Bolivia, there was a sort of reversal in erosion of rule of law. And for all intents and purposes, we would say that rule of law was undermined to a certain degree by the entire episode. And it's good that in Bolivia they've returned to a democratic course, but in the short term, the legacy of Evo Morales is mixed. Just because while he did do significant work and made a lot of progress on the social and the economic front for Bolivians, and especially indigenous Bolivians, he also weakened democratic institutions and weakened the capacity of the rule of law to obtain there as well. Jeffrey, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just find it interesting how protests and military pressures will helped remove Evo Morales, if I got that correct. Um, because in Venezuela, when the leader basically claimed victory after their recent election, obviously, he lost the presidential election, but he basically still claimed victory, and a lot of people got mad, but nothing was done simply because I think that he had the military on his side, but and not the people. So I
Who
think
claimed
that's what helped
victory?
him. The dictator of Venezuela.
Yeah, so I think that the outcome of the election said that he was the victor, just because they're not fair elections, they're sham elections. But as far as I know, he didn't, quote unquote, lose the election, right?
Well, from what I learned in Poly 3, what I learned was that apparently he did lose the election, but like actually looking at the statistics of and all the numbers, but it's like he still claimed the victory. I could be wrong
No,
because
no,
since
I,
it's
I what I agree with what you're saying. For all intents, like, he clearly probably lost the election, right? He's lost all of the elections going back many years, but they're not fair elections. So the official or the stated outcome that the government says is that he's the victor. But the thing about Venezuela that's different is that the military sides with the the socialist government and the socialist party in Venezuela, and that has a lot to do with the way that the military was socialized by the socialist government under Hugo Chavez in earlier decades. And it's a very, very complex situation, and we can't do it justice addressing it here. But needless to say, it is different than Bolivia. It's significantly different. It's also the case that in Bolivia, society had not been demobilized in the way that it has in Venezuela. And it's just very different. So it's hard for us to compare the two. But there are other examples in Latin America that do highlight a similar process of decay and erosion. And another one comes from Guatemala, where the incumbent president, Alejandro Giamatti, did win re-election in 2019, but only after he disqualified the leading opposition candidate. And that candidate was the former attorney general, and in particular, an anti-corruption trailblazer, an official who had led official efforts to rat out corruption. And in that capacity had opposed this Giamatti's closure of an anti-corruption commission. And so he had a target on his chest. And eventually Giamatti did remove him and eliminate him from the competition, simply disqualifying him. And this being another example of this erosion of the rule of law in the way in which the rule of law seems to be quite fragile. What you see over and over in these cases is a growing concentration of power in the executive. And you see the weakening of those checks and balances. You see the weakening of horizontal accountability. Remember that horizontal accountability has to do with the capacity of co-equal branches to hold each other accountable and to prevent or counteract abuses of power so as to ensure equality and to ensure accountability and compliance, right? Obedience to the constitutional framework, the rules of the game that all must obey. And this concentration of power in the executive works against that development of the rule of law. It undermines that rule of law. And the pattern in all these countries seems to be a similar one, where leaders neuter courts, they neuter prosecutors and legislatures, media, oversight and regulatory agencies, electoral bodies. They take away their formal powers, or they pack them, they weaken them, they undermine their independence in some concrete, substantive way. And then once they've done that, they turn these same institutions against their political opponents. And so they use the media to abuse their rivals. They use electoral bodies to disqualify their rivals. They alter or undermine the independence of the judiciary or the legislature so as to tilt the playing field and give themselves a level up. All of this is done in a way that gives them an advantage or a position from which they can overcome their rivals and they can entrench their power. And the question for us is, what is this an indication of regarding the democratic rule of law? Is this good for the rule of law, or on the whole, does this undermine rule of law? Max says that overwhelmingly undermines the rule of law. What aspect of rule of law in particular suffers as a result of this trend? Does anyone want to address that question? What does this affect in particular with regard to rule of law? Jake says, growing concentration of power affects accountability in the executive, without a doubt, right? Max says, it does not restrict arbitrary exercise of power. There you go. Rule of law means first and foremost, subjecting and subordinating the expression of power to well-established rules, right? In these concentrations of power in the executive and this increasingly authoritarian behavior totally overwhelms that, right? It concentrates power. It works against accountability. Max says, had to find the definition in my notes. We've got a couple minutes left, and I think the most interesting question for us is number 2. If you want to finish this sentence, I would really be interested in seeing how you finish it. Democratic rule of law is subject to blank. How would you finish the sentence? Any takers?
I think I would say democratic rule of law is subject to change. I think that's yeah.
Yeah, subject to change, right? Because it's quite fragile. And this is one of the ironies, isn't it? It's so fundamental and so critical and foundational, and yet it appears to be so fleeting and so fragile and so amorphous and difficult to consolidate and to perpetuate and to hold on to. And I would suggest to you that even the United States demonstrates how fragile the democratic rule of law can be and how much the democratic rule of law relies on the behavior of the individual and the choices of individuals to comply with existing norms of behavior or not, right? We might have a set of rules. Compliance with that set of rules is a separate question. It's just a piece of paper at the end of the day, the Constitution. Whether the actors actually obey the Constitution, that is a separate issue. And different actors are created differently, and they may have different motivations and different interests and different responsibilities, and they may have a different sense of the importance or the incentive associated with that rule of law. And as a result, we might have a fragile rule of law, one that changes with the political environment. As Max says, democratic rule of law is subject to change. Regimes are subject to change. New democracies are subject to backsliding. Rule of law in the same way is quite fleeting and could be quite fragile, and it could be subject to backsliding. It could be subject to change. And before I let you go, let me just read what these contributors have said. Efren says, I would say that democratic rule of law is subject to political participation. Haley says, democratic rule of law is subject to who has the power at the given time. Yeah, touche. Which suggests that maybe even rule of law is political, right? Rule of law for who? Michael says democratic rule of law is subject to accountability. The main reason for why the impeachment of Richard Nixon worked was because he resigned from office. Touche. All right, thanks everybody. I'm going to let you go for now, and we'll start our new unit on citizen and social class on Wednesday.